O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are covering the Plymouth Pilgrims, originally from Nottinghamshire, Scrooby, England. We are going to give an overview of their whole journey from England to Holland, then to North America, where they planted the Plymouth colony. And we're going to do this because it's right after Thanksgiving, and we wanted to go back and give a greater coverage of it, show you some interesting facts about them, and also just to inform people about things that are so misunderstood about them. Also, how important would you put the Plymouth Pilgrims as being, Casey? Because I think they're pretty important in both American history and in Christian history.
Yeah, I'd say definitely both of those. I'd say in English history, they definitely deserve some time as well.
Right, because so just to give some reasons why they are so important. For one thing, one of the first settlers in what later became the American colonies, settling in the first settlers in New England. Before that, there were the Jamestown settlers.
There was a colony in Maine too.
Oh, okay.
In the early maybe like 10 or 15 years before.
Okay.
But that was unsuccessful.
Yeah.
And I would say the Plymouth colony was the first really successful colony. Jamestown got there, but it took them a while. They lost a lot of people, and they were really struggling until they found, was it tobacco that they started growing?
Yeah.
And that really started to make them profitable. But with Plymouth, you see that they really start to grow very quickly. And once it starts to catch on, that's the first place that you just see mass migration to. And so I would kind of call it the first really successful American colony.
Okay. Also, they drew up the Mayflower Compact, which is one of the first American semi-constitutions, right? That's drawn up. Also, so like you said, mass migration. The Plymouth colony, they were really kind of the catalyst for starting the large Puritan migration that happened later on in the 1600s that went to Massachusetts Bay colony. So although Plymouth colony didn't last very long. By the mid 1600s, pretty much they had lost their economic power, and it wasn't really that important. But they did serve as a beacon for the rest of the colonies, and their story is it's inspiring and encouraging what they were willing to do in order to practice their faith according to their consciences. So let's start off with their origins. In 1607, in the village of Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, England, they started a church that broke off from the Anglican Church. So they were called the Separatists. And the leaders, I don't know all of the leaders. Among the leaders were John Smith, actually, that we're going to talk about a little later. So you're John Robinson and William Brewster. John Robinson, and I believe John Smith as well, they were college educated, formally trained ministers
But they were in the Netherlands for a bit before, right? Or am I making that up?
Maybe John Smith. I don't
Okay.
believe John Robinson was. Yeah, but they really started their separatist Puritan ministries in the village of Scrooby. So they were meeting in homes for the most part for like a year. And so this was under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, which had they were under the Acts of Uniformity, right?
Yeah.
They were
Well, what
called
year
the
was
Acts
that?
of Uniformity, 1607.
So that would have been James the First. Elizabeth would have died in
Oh, okay.
1603, I think.
Okay, it was right after Elizabeth.
Yeah, but still
she
very
had a major impact.
a very
on England.
Elizabethan time though. Still,
Right. James I wasn't that much better though. So at this time in England, you had to, if in order to practice Christianity, you had to go by the rules of the established church, which was the Church of England. You had to follow their liturgy. You had to use their prayer book. You had to conduct your services the way that the Anglican Church did. In other words, you had to be a member of the Church of England if you wanted to practice Christianity. Basically, to practice another form of Christianity besides Anglican Christianity was illegal.
yeah.
And so they were going against the law. These men in this congregation of over 100 people by the time they were ready to leave. So eventually, they decided, we're not going to be able to do this for very long without getting in trouble. So they decided we need to leave for the best place nearby to practice Christianity according to our consciences, which was Holland. So Holland was a Protestant nation. Non-Catholic. It was right nearby, right across the English Channel, and Holland had recently gotten their independence from Spain, and so they were an established Protestant republic that would not persecute Calvinistic Protestant Christians. So they decided to go there, and that was in between 1607 and 1608. So their first attempt to get there failed. I forgot the exact story. I think it was an English ship that they decided to go across on first of all, but then they tried a Dutch ship, and when the Dutch ship came over, the meeting place where they were, which was near the town of Plymouth, so this is why they're called the Plymouth Pilgrims. The English authorities had discovered that they were leaving, and so the English authorities were basically chasing them to their point of departure, and the Dutch ship most of the Plymouth men got on board the ship, but their wives and their children were stuck on the shore, and with the English authorities bearing down on them. And so they were freaking out, but the Dutch captain of the ship would not allow them to go back and get their women and children. So they were stuck there. They were captured by the English authorities, and because they didn't have. So by this point in time, they had basically given up everything because they were selling their possessions in order to fund their trip to Holland. So they basically had nothing. So the women and children have nothing, and so eventually the English authorities take pity on them instead of arresting them and confining them. They take pity on them and allow them to go to Holland to reunite with their families. And so according to William Bradford, who is at this point in time, he's a young man in his early 20s when they leave England, but he eventually becomes the first governor of the Plymouth colony, and he records that through various means, he doesn't describe how, somehow they all get to England, this group, this body of over 100 people. I'm sorry, not England, Holland, and they arrive at the city of Amsterdam, and they spend a year in Amsterdam in 1608, trying to. So they're farmers, but there in Holland they have to change their occupations. I don't know exactly what they do, but there's a lot of trading in Amsterdam. There's fishing. There's a fur trade. So by some means or other, they make a living for themselves, but they find that it's so hard to do these occupations that they need to leave for somewhere else. So they decide in the city of Leiden, which is a manufacturing city for linen. And at Leiden, there's a university, which John Robinson actually comes into contact with, and he helps them with some academic stuff. But so John Robinson, he was their head pastor. William Brewster is he's the main ruling elder. So in their church structure, they have pastors and ruling elders. They have the leaders that actually teach the scriptures, which are the pastors, like John Robinson. He was the only one. And then they have ruling elders who are just mature men with authority to administrate, to oversee the congregation, but they are not given the task of teaching the scriptures on a regular basis. And then also they have John Smith, who is another one of their leaders, and actually he breaks off eventually from the congregation, and he actually forms one of the first Baptist congregations in England. He goes back to England and forms a Baptist congregation because he disagrees with them over, at the very least, baptism and other things. He actually becomes a general Baptist. But so they're in the city of Leiden for about 11 years. They're in Holland for a total of 12 years. And according to William Bradford, their labors are like they have to work to the bone. They have to do things that they're not used to. And by the time of their end of the end of their stay in Holland, he says that they are so overworked that a lot of the young people are just like they're physically strained, and their health is poor, and a lot of them have died by this point in time. And so they decide in the year, around 1619, 1620, probably the beginning of 1620, they start discussing what they're going to do. And they decide, also another consideration with why they left Holland was that their children were basically becoming Dutch children.
Yeah. They
were learning the language, and they were also learning the culture, which they didn't approve of, because the Netherlands, although it had a state church and it was largely Protestant, they were also pretty because of their economic prosperity, they were becoming increasingly secular and worldly. There were a lot of people who were just greedy people. So apparently those that the lapse in morals was affecting their children. They didn't like that either. So they decided. So we don't. Yeah.
Another consideration too was that so William Brewster was a printer. I mean, he had a printing press and was putting out a large number of books. And I think in like 1618 he put out maybe 7 books against like King James and the laws of England or the Church of England. When I say against, I mean just saying, not necessarily saying he's evil, but maybe. But going through some of the practices of the Anglican Church and saying why he thought they were wrong, and these were kind of smuggled into England, and the English authorities actually found him in the Netherlands, and I think they found him once and they warned him, like, you can't do this anymore, but he continued to do it, and they found him again, and I think they made him get, they cut off the printing press, so he couldn't print anymore.
Wow.
And so part of that was all right, England still has authority over us here somehow. So that was also another factor to be. We aren't as free as we thought we were from the English.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So while they're in Holland, but they also in Holland the Dutch say that they are they're like the hardest workers that they've ever ever seen before. Their congregation is very popular. Dutch people actually come to hear John Robinson preach, and because a lot of people, a lot of people are under. Probably, I would have to guess that a lot of people are under the impression that if you were not well studied in this, if you don't actually, seriously consider the histories and the accounts, that the Pilgrims were just a bunch of they were basically self-righteous hypocrites, or at least somewhat self-righteous hypocrites who were just had a Christianity that was just like a moralism, doing good works and so on, or they were these hyper Calvinists that thought that you didn't preach the gospel to people because so salvation was just the caricature of Calvinism that says salvation is only a work of God, so don't do anything, and the only way you can find out if you're a Christian is if you suddenly start becoming godly and living a righteous life. But I want to eliminate any of those things, and I want to show you some first-hand accounts of John Robinson. So John Robinson taught them for about 12 years, and I want to show you what his beliefs about the gospel were. Just to give you a background, this will show us what the congregation of the Pilgrims, what most of them believed, because he was teaching them during this time. So John Robinson wrote a bunch of essays. They're called Essays Divine and Moral, in his volume, in the Works of John Robinson, Volume 1, that you can find online. About true religion, so he says in that, when he speaks about what is true Christianity, a man hath in truth so much religion as he hath between the Lord and himself in secret, and no more, what shows soever he makes before men, and makes sound proof of his religion both before God and men, so far as he is forward and ready to every good work, especially to the works of mercy towards them that need. Then he quotes James 1:27 that says, pure religion and undefiled is to visit the orphans and widows in their affliction. And so on the gospel, when he talks about the Holy Scriptures, in his essay on the Holy Scriptures, he says, the utmost ordinary means of revelation of God's will for man's salvation and happiness is the gospel. When the law written in man's heart by creation was almost worn out, God gave it written in tables of stone. But life and freedom from sin and death being impossible to the law in that it was weak through the flesh, and all men by it, whether considered as written in tables of stone or of the heart by creation, coming short of the glory of God, it hath pleased the same God by the gospel of his Son Christ to provide a gracious remedy that the sick to death, by the justice of the law, might be cured, the death of Jesus. Yea, the dead revived, by the grace of the gospel and mercy of God therein. And other remedy besides and beyond this, for the obtaining of salvation God hath not revealed. He that fulfills not the righteousness of the law violates God's justice. But remaining obstinate against the grace of the gospel also he despises with God's justice, his mercy, and his authority in both. So just showing the gospel goes to those who need it. The gospel is a gospel of mercy. And then finally, when he writes about regeneration, and he's actually giving a refutation of some of John Smith's beliefs, or his congregation's beliefs on regeneration. He writes. So this is his beliefs basically about the gospel, how God uses the gospel for salvation. He says, this work of grace then, in the general, God beginneth ordinarily, so the work of regeneration. He beginneth ordinarily by the ministry of his word, and first, you want to pick up?
No, you got it.
Because I don't have it.
Oh, okay. Let's see. And first of the law, which through man's inability to keep it, convinceth and condemneth him, and so leaves him under God's curse. From whence also ariseth in the mind a servile fear of God and his judgments, with grief and sorrow in respect thereof, which is commonly called legal repentance, or, better, penitency, and so a despairing of all remedy in a man's self. Want me to keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So then it talks about Romans chapter 8, verse 3, I think is, in chapter 7, and Galatians. Then cometh the gospel of glad tidings, offering grace and mercy unto those who, being weary and heavy laden, do come unto Christ for ease and rest by believing in him. God with and by the same gospel ministering and conveying the graces of his Spirit into the heart, by which a man becomes of a natural man a spiritual man, and of these graces first and principally faith, by which Christ is received. John 1 verse 12, and the life of grace begun, as Paul testifieth in Galatians 2 verse 20, that he lived by faith in the Son of God, from which faith and assurance of the forgiveness of sins, and so great love of God shed into the heart of a miserable sinner, ariseth by reflection, as it were, a love again towards God, and from this love a godly sorrow for sin, wrought against so good a God, and from this sorrow true repentance, and the turning of the heart from evil to good, with an hatred, fear, and earnest endeavor to avoid sin in respect of God's mercy, as on the contrary a love, desire, and constant endeavor of and unto whatsoever pleaseth him. Now all these and all other truly spiritual graces, howsoever wrought by that one Spirit and at one time, yet are in the order of nature and manifestation, one before another, and so faith, the cause of the rest.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, that's nice.
And that's a great presentation of the gospel. Except he could have emphasized the cross more. But if you're ever wondering what the Pilgrims believed about the gospel, that's basically what they believed. That the gospel is a free offer of salvation to perishing sinners, and you must turn from your sin and put your trust in Jesus to be forgiven and have mercy and peace with God and eternal life. So they preached the gospel. They had the belief that you were supposed to preach the gospel. As we're going to see, that was quite lacking in their endeavors. But by the time of 1619, like you were saying, for those various considerations, they had a council with their leaders, and they said we need to leave Holland, and so the best place to start afresh, basically to have freedom, so that we can to have the ability to found a society that is most in keeping with the scriptures as possible. We need to go to the new world. So they had two considerations: either Virginia or New Guinea, or I'm sorry, Guinea, which I think it's in the Caribbean. But eventually they settled on going to Virginia under the general government of the Virginia colony. So that was their goal, to get to Virginia. Yeah. And eventually, so they had two main English companies that they were considering getting funding from, and they settled eventually on what was called the Virginia Company, who kind of forced them into a less favorable contract than they had desired. But it was for a 7-year contract, and they would be there, giving resources back to the company from their time in the New World. So in 1619. In 1620, they depart from Holland in 2 ships, the Speedwell, and I think it was the Mayflower.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, is they go to England, but the Speedwell, the smaller ship, is leaking. So eventually they decide we can't take the Speedwell, so we have to take only the Mayflower.
There is some intrigue on that too.
Right.
About, you want to go for it, or?
No, you go.
Okay, so basically the Dutch at that time did not have a colony yet, but they had claimed the area of the Hudson River when Henry Hudson had sailed under the banner of the Dutch and had claimed, that area that we think of as like lower New York, Manhattan, like that type of area now. And so, and where the Virginia went up to the Hudson River according to the English maps. And so the Pilgrims, though they didn't call themselves Pilgrims yet, but anyway, they wanted to go as far away from Jamestown as they could and still be in Virginia, so they were shooting right for the southern banks of the Hudson River. And so the Dutch, their intelligence, supposedly, had heard this and wasn't very happy about it, and so they paid off a couple of people to sabotage the trip. And so, like a couple decades later, the Dutch were taking credit for the Speedwell not being seaworthy.
Interesting. Well, obviously didn't prevent them from getting there.
Yeah, they got there still.
So God overruled man.
But then there's also theories that the ship captain
right
took them to Cape Cod instead. There's a couple and so like they actually like the Dutch kind of succeeded in not having them down at the Hudson River. But there's also a theory that when did they left in like September, right?
Yep.
So they left in September, and there's also the theory that a lot of people say that the ship got blown off course. Most people that are studied in it say that's not really the case. That they had been traveled to the New World. Obviously, wasn't great, but they'd done it quite a bit at that point. And so a lot of people say more that he realized it was September and they had to get in before winter,
right.
And so it's a lot shorter trip if you stay more north. So to go to Cape Cod is a lot shorter than to go down to like Virginia area, and so he figured he'd hit Cape Cod, and then they did try to go south from there once they hit the landmark, but I think there was some type of shoal where the captain was like, I can't do it, and so we're gonna have to be here, and so then they started looking for a spot to inhabit.
Yeah. Oh, what I forgot to mention is actually most of the original congregation that left England, they first remained in Holland. So it was actually a smaller group that went over on the Mayflower. John Robinson stayed back in Holland to pastor the congregation. William Brewster was their main leader that went with them to the New World. So it's a voyage of a couple of months, September to November. 2 people die, from what I read. One guy is thrown overboard and he survives.
John Holland.
Don't know how.
No. So there was the way they had the sails and the riggings. For some reason, the captain had them kind of like slack, and so there was actually ropes hanging down into the water behind the ship. And so when he fell overboard, he was able to grab one of these ropes, and then they were able to pull him up. So. Gotcha. Which is usually if you fall overboard at that time, you're done.
Right. So remember. So it was a voyage of a couple months. They're not used to traveling on a ship for long periods of time. The seas are rough. The storms are terrible. Their food is pretty terrible. They're eating hardtack, which is a cracker with no flavor that can last a long time. And actually, from what people say, a lot of their hardtack got moldy, so they were eating moldy food. They have a lack of vitamin C, so their nutrition is not good by the time they get to the New World. And they're getting there at the beginning of November, when winter is starting. So this is a huge it's a huge trial that they have to go through. When they get to New England, because they haven't reached to where they were going to, they're not quote unquote under the jurisdiction of the Virginia colony. So in order to make because not all of them were pilgrims. Some of them were hired laborers. The crewmen were not part of the separatists for the most part. They were not at heart really invested in what the Pilgrims were setting out to do, which was to create a Christian community, basically. And in order to deter people from rebelling and mutiny, not going along with living in a just society, not getting along with each other, they drew up the Mayflower Compact, which for the sake of time I'm not going to read, but it's an agreement that we will, because we are not in Virginia, we're going to form our own government, and we agree to elect officers and to enact laws that we agree to abide by. And then they signed most of the men.
I think all of the men did.
Right, men were probably like 20 and over or something. They signed this compact agree. So because they were basically, so it was basically a democratic republic. They had a say in the government, and they agreed that we're going to form a government once we get settled, and we're going to live by its laws and live under the authority of the governors there. So
as they've landed, and then they are looking for a place to settle their colony. And at first, they send off these smaller ships to go and search for a good place. And at first, they have their first encounter with the Indians.
Yeah,
do you have a note there?
That's in December.
In December, and that's not where they ended up settling, because that was a bit of a skirmish.
Right, and no one is harmed. At least none of the. I don't think they even killed any of the Indians.
Yeah, but some guns are fired, and they're like, that's probably not the place. Also, at this time, when they're off on one of these voyages, there's like an ice storm, and William Bradford is one of the ones off, and he gets back, and he finds out that his wife has perished, that she fell overboard, and there's. I mean, like, it was an ice storm, and if you're on the deck, and she fell and you slip, then that's it. But so that was another notable thing here. Eventually, they do hear about this village. I think it was Patuxet, which had been wiped out by disease of the Indian. The Indians, there had been an Indian village there, had been wiped out by disease, and so there wouldn't be much resistance if they went there, and so that's where they decide to go and settle.
And during this winter, about at least half of them die.
Yeah.
During the winter, due to poor nutrition and lack of food, and for most of this time, only about 7 of them are healthy enough to do anything of value. So you have 7 people. Most of the leaders, so William Brewster, Miles Standish, who was their military commander, and Edward Winslow, who later becomes a governor, and then a couple of the other men. They are the only ones healthy enough, taking care of the sick. Most of them are sick during this time. You have 7 healthy people over the course of a few months, taking care of them. Half of them die. So they go from over 100 to about 50 people.
Yeah.
50
yeah. So that's one thing is once you actually get to the first Thanksgiving. Well, the first Thanksgiving there. It's in the fall of 1621.
Right.
I think there's about 50 people, and less than half of them are working age men. So we're talking I think there were 22 men left that are, and so when you think about numbers and how big of a community this was a very small community at this point.
Right. But in the spring of 1621, they befriend the Native American Samoset. Right.
Yeah.
I think he's a member of the Wampanoag tribe.
Yep.
He actually speaks some broken English. That's how they.
Yeah. Well, so this is another misconception too, is that the Indians, seeing the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, have been like, "What is this?" At this point, they've been having dealings with European ships for at least 100 years, and we're talking on an annual basis. And so Samoset speaks English because he's one of the people from the tribe that goes and trades with the ships. And so, like I said, it's a misconception that the Indians don't know what's happening or who these people are. They do have a pretty good idea, and even a better idea in that when we see a couple days after Samoset meets them, Squanto is introduced, and I think
he speaks better English because he's been
Squantum is his name. Yeah, and he was, I think in 1614 he was captured and taken as a slave to Spain, where he was, I think some Catholic friars actually bought him free.
Yeah. And
he ended up in England for like 5 years. And then he managed to get on a ship and comes back, and he goes to his village, which was Patuxet.
Yeah.
And everybody's dead. And so he goes to the neighboring village in the Wampanoags and lives with them, but then he's introduced to these Pilgrims, and for the next, I think, 20 months before he dies, he lives with the Pilgrims, and he shows them a lot of the Indian tricks of the land, I guess, like growing corn, like the Three Sisters. If you learned about that in school, like where to fish, those types of things, where the best hunting areas are, and really plays a huge role in these guys surviving and building up enough food to make it through the next winter.
Right. Not only that, but he also negotiates peace between the English and other tribes. Right?
Yeah, well, so there is some intrigue with that I didn't realize until I studied this. So Massasoit is the chief or the sachem of the Wampanoags, and he had sent Squanto to the Pilgrims. But so as Squanto realizes more and more that he's a vital piece to the Pilgrims, there is some friction between him and Massasoit, that he starts to undermine Massasoit, and he starts dealing with other Indian tribes for the Pilgrims. And there's two different real opinions about what exactly he was playing at. One is that he was trying to eventually take over from Massasoit through his important role with the Pilgrims, and then the other one is just that he was more Anglicanized than the Indians thought, that he actually had bought into the European colonization theory and was like, yeah, I want to help these guys succeed. Either way, I do think you can kind of look at Squanto and be like, the Pilgrims were a good fit for him, and that imagine being in Europe for several years and coming back, he probably felt like he didn't really fit in quite the way that most Indians did.
Yeah.
But obviously he wasn't European. He didn't fit in Europe. But to have these Pilgrims that are now in this land trying to survive, so he grew very close to them. But yeah, so there was quite a bit of friction between Massasoit and Squanto, to the point where Squanto basically set up something where he made the Pilgrims think that Massasoit was attacking them, so that they would attack him. But they found out kind of the last minute that Massasoit had no plans to attack them, and Massasoit demanded Squanto be handed over to be executed, and the Pilgrims said no, he's too vital to us, we can't, and they almost went to war over this. It was very, very tense, and Massasoit didn't talk to them for a while, and then Squanto went and I think it's William Bradford's thing, but it doesn't say a lot of detail about it. Basically, that Squanto went and made peace with Massasoit, but then not very long after that, Squanto died. And William Bradford says he got the Indian fever. Some people like to conject that Massasoit had him assassinated. But I don't know if you could ever really know that. But so he dies, I think, in 1622, and then so that starts to cool things down. And then actually Massasoit gets very ill. He was constipated, and Edward Winslow goes and with the European medicine is able to heal him and stays basically at his bedside. And after that, Massasoit is completely favorable towards them, favorable enough that he tells them of a plot of another tribe that he's aware of, that they're actually coming for you pretty soon, you should look into this, and really helps them avoid that disaster.
Well, next let's talk about the first Thanksgiving, but first we'll take a short break and we'll get back to you with the first Thanksgiving. Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, recovering and applying the Apostles' teaching on the church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog. To know Christ and Him crucified. So in 1621,
I thought you said the first Thanksgiving. No, sorry, that was a bad joke.
I don't get it.
No, just that really any Thanksgiving to God, probably Adam.
Oh, okay. That's actually a good one. So by 1621, their first full year, they have planted through the instruction of Squanto. and they have a good crop by the fall of 1621. So this was just a common thing.
Yeah.
That you would do even back in England.
Yeah.
Is to celebrate the harvest.
Yeah.
And so they had a 3-day festival.
Which actually, I did have a quote there that I forget which historian wrote it, but basically about this being the first Thanksgiving, but that this was the first American Protestant Christian Thanksgiving north of Virginia and south of Maine.
Right. Actually, there had been earlier. There had been a quote unquote Thanksgiving Day that was celebrated in the Virginia colony.
Yeah.
But they didn't have a 3-day feast like these people did. So from Edward Winslow, who was one of the leaders, this is his account of the first Thanksgiving. He said, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might, after a special manner, rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms." So they shot some guns, like some good rednecks. "Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted." 90 men. "And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation, and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want, that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." So he's writing back to England, talking about their their first Thanksgiving celebration.
I think the reason this one really captures the mind of people is the combination of the Indians and the Pilgrims. Mm-hmm. Which, in studying it, I learned, so the Wampanoag tradition is that they weren't invited, there's some other things to back this up, that they heard the gunfire, and as allies, and that's why he just showed up with 90 men, as allies, they wondered if they were being attacked. And so, they came to fight, to fight for the Pilgrims. Yeah. And then showing up and be like, "Oh, a feast," so go kill some deer or something, we'll join you. And actually, a year or 2 later, the Pilgrims sent to Wampanoag to be like we can't afford to do another thing feast like that. Basically, to feed you all is very difficult, and also they were having troubles with other Indian tribes, and so they're like, other Indian tribes will show up and expect us to feed them, but then they're also violent towards us. So we can't just be open to Indians coming. I think by 1623, they did. An Indian that had been like that, they had killed, beheaded, and stuck his head on a pike, to warn Indians not to just waltz in. So that was kind of a problem for him. But this first one went well.
Yeah. You know what's notably missing from the first Thanksgiving?
What's that?
A gospel presentation.
Yeah.
To the Indians. That's one thing that I'm disappointed in the Pilgrims for, is their lack of missionary zeal.
Yeah.
In preaching the gospel, they didn't discuss it before they went. When John Robinson, their pastor, gave them a farewell, both a farewell sermon and a farewell letter. In the accounts of the sermon, it doesn't say anything about them.
When you say, you mean a farewell and that he knew he was dying?
No. That when they were about to depart from Holland.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In the accounts of that sermon and in the letter that you can read, he doesn't say anything about you being a band that's going to preach. They're going to reach the natives with the gospel and make disciples of them. Although, so they did give at least lip service to it. In the Mayflower Compact, one of the reasons that they say that they have come is to advance the Christian faith. And William Bradford, when he talks about why they decide to go to the New World, he says, "They had a great hope and inward zeal of laying some good foundation for propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world." Yeah. So it wasn't until decades later that they really that the English colonists there, or the English in general, really had a concerted effort and resolution to reach the natives with the gospel. I don't know. I haven't studied up on their missionary efforts in the 1600s, but I know in the early 1700s, eventually you have major missionary efforts.
I think in the 1640s they had somebody that actually like went in and was actually pretty successful with the Wampanoags. Started converting Indians, and then even having the Indians become missionaries, going to other Indians. And actually in the 1660s or 70s, when King Philip's War was, there was actually a few thousand Native Americans that were Christians.
Oh, wow.
They were kind of like caught in the middle and not sure like what to do. And King Philip actually attacked them, and they were a large reason that the colonists, I guess you could call them at that point. One was because I think it was like 5,000 or 6,000 Christian Native Americans that basically went to war for them because they sided with them because they were Christian, and King Philip, who was Metacom, Massasoit's son actually,
That's a cool name.
Yeah, didn't recognize them as like Native Americans. He viewed them as, you've left our religion and you've joined
apostates.
Yeah, and so there were quite a number of them that were converted at that point.
Oh, praise the Lord for that. Just to as a note on that, just to show you that there wasn't any like to show you that there was at least some concern on the part of the colonists for the salvation of the natives. John Robinson wrote a letter to William Bradford in 1623 talking about a fight that had happened where some of the colonists under Miles Standish had killed some of the Native Americans, and Robinson writes, "You will say they deserved it, so being killed. I grant it, but upon what provocations and invitements by those heathenish Christians? Besides, you, being no magistrates over them, were to consider not what they deserved, but what you were by necessity constrained to inflict. Necessity of this, especially of..." Oh, I'm sorry. I should have just read the first sentence. He says, "Concerning the killing of those poor Indians, of which we heard at first by report, and since by more certain relation, oh, how happy a thing had it been if you had converted some before you had killed any. Besides, where blood is once begun to be shed, it is seldom stanched of a long time after." So Robinson was concerned about them, evangelizing the Native Americans, but they were not very successful, at least in the beginning.
I do want to talk a little bit about the more in general, the Native American relations. You get with Thanksgiving now. A number of people kind of view it as like this taking advantage of the Native Americans, and they try to paint the Pilgrims as being these European colonists who came over and oppressed them.
Yeah.
And so there was definitely a lot of friction between the two groups. The Wampanoags were peaceful with them and actually maintained peace until King Philip's War, so like 50 years of peace with them. One of the reasons the Wampanoags allied themselves with the Pilgrims was because they also were at war with there were a lot of different tribes, and so to view, I think it's unfair to view it as like the colonists just came in and oppressed.
Yeah.
In that these tribes were all fighting each other, and the colonists were suddenly a new tribe.
Yeah.
And also the colonists had better weapons. And if you flip it around and you put the better weapons in the Indians' hands, I have no doubt that they would have eradicated the colonists without a second thought.
Right.
And so I think it's a little bit unfair to be like, oh, what oppressive people.
It's for sure unfair.
But like I said, that was their style. It was a game of war, and they all understood it as that they're fighting that way. And pretty early on,
about the natives.
Yeah, the natives, and I think the colonists, the Pilgrims, understand that they have to defend themselves, otherwise they'll be killed. And they'll list a lot of modern historians will list some of the they'll call them massacres of when the Pilgrims attacked a village. Usually this was after if they're traveling and if they were traveling in small bands, they were liable to be killed by Indians. So you'd get that happen. You get little villages as we get further into history, and there's more population there. Little villages would be raided. The people would be killed. The children would be taken. And so it goes both ways. Like they both were killing each other. The Indians were a huge fear of the Pilgrims and of the future colonists
Right.
for quite some time. And then in King Philip's War, that was nasty.
Which is the late 1600s.
Like 1660s.
Yeah.
I forget the numbers exactly, but it was one of those where both sides realized, like, it wasn't just men fighting men.
Mm-hmm.
It was, let's go destroy villages.
Right.
And so you just get a lot
total
of
war.
Yeah, you get a lot of women and children killed on both sides, and
Mm-hmm.
just little towns utterly destroyed
Mm-hmm.
both ways, which is terrible. But like I said, it went both ways.
Right. But thankfully, that was not until later that those really major conflicts.
Yeah, well, there was the
that
Pequot
happens.
War
Right.
in the 30s, and
Yeah.
Massasoit was actually, like, advised the Pilgrims what to do during that, and was allies with them through it as they were fighting. I don't know, it may have been the Narragansetts, and basically this was started by, there were 3 or 4 instances where, like, maybe like 5 to 10 of the Pilgrims were killed, just because, like, if they were traveling or the Indians saw a chance to take them, they would. And so after this happens a few times, and the Pilgrims are like, we really, like, they felt like we had to do something about this, and there were economic reasons for this too. The fur trade was one of the major aspects of it, and the Narragansetts had a stranglehold on that for a long time, and the Pilgrims coming in were starting to develop a fur trade, and so the Narragansetts were thinking, for our livelihood, we can't let them continue doing this.
Right.
And so that's why they were after the Pilgrims. And so that was one of the repercussions of that the Pilgrims won that pretty handily. And so they got a big foot into the fur trading from that.
Yeah. But for the most part, the Plymouth settlers they try to maintain peace as much as possible. It's not like they were going in to conquer.
Yeah.
To conquer these people, they did want to reach. For the most part, they did want to reach them.
And I will say
God's
too,
word.
The Pilgrims, unlike a lot of the colonists, all their land they bought. That they had agreed that they would not just take land. They understood that this was the property of the Indians. Now the Indians, to be fair to them, as we get towards King Philip in, like, the 1660s, they hadn't really they understood selling the land as a more nomadic people. Not that they weren't. So that's another. These Indians weren't nomadic. Like,
right.
a lot of people view, like, Plains Indians. These were not Plains Indians.
Right.
They had villages, but they would move around a little bit.
Yeah.
They didn't. They understood they were selling the land. They didn't really view it as this is forever. Like, your grandchildren are living in the house you built there, and it's going to stand there forever. But like I said, the Pilgrims did decide that we won't just take land, we will buy it. And Massasoit orchestrated a lot of sales of land, so that the Pilgrims did get a lot of land, but they bought it.
All right, so on our last several minutes here, I just want to go through a bunch of the major events in Plymouth Colony up to the point where they basically went into economic decline, and it was basically not profitable to live there anymore. So they largely disbanded the.
But I would say
the
also
settlement.
they really ushered in the Massachusetts Bay.
Right. I want to get. I want to get to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
In November of 1621, right after their first Thanksgiving feast, 35 new colonists get to the colony. They have no more supplies though, so we have 35 more people to feed. So they have to cut their rations in half by that point in time. Like you said, in 1622, Squanto dies of an illness. And actually, what I wanted to point out was that, some people think that he was using his role, his special role, like you suggested, in order to assert himself, in order to make himself more powerful and more prominent. Like he was, seeking his own glory, and basically to get the respect of the other natives.
Yeah.
And so it could be viewed that he was struck. The Lord struck him down with an illness.
I should say too. I forget. I'll try to quote it, but so on his deathbed, William Bradford stayed with Squantum for several days until he died, which is another thing. You see that with their Indian allies, that these guys really loved them. The Pilgrims did.
Right.
And so on his deathbed, Squantum did tell William Bradford, "I want to go to the white man's heaven."
Right.
So
Bradford prayed for him.
Yeah, so I don't know if you really... I don't know what else went on there, if he really understood the gospel that well. I would hope so, but...
No, we can't assume, unfortunately. But Squanto was also rescued by Miles Standish at one point when he was captured by a hostile other tribe. But so that's just another act of kindness that the Pilgrims did for another native. But in 1623, so up to that point in 1623, they had been basically they had a common stock of their produce and their goods. It was kind of a quote unquote communal system of labor. In 1623, they found out that wasn't working because people were not working hard enough in order to provide enough for every individual person. So they gave that up, and each household received 1 acre for their own crops to produce their own crops each for each household. In the summer of 1623, 100 more colonists arrive to the settlement. Then in September of that summer, Edward Winslow returns to England and he sells resources they had gotten, from their trade as well as some of their crops and things. He reports to the Virginia Company that was funding their trip to tell them how things were going. Then in the next year, 1624, there was an incident with two men, John Lifford and I forgot it. I don't know what his first name was. This guy named Oldham, who have arrived. John Lifford Lyford is apparently an ordained minister, and he starts writing letters to be sent back to England, accusing the colonists of doing things that are against their agreement with the company, and they're basically unfaithful to England. So he's slandering them, and then eventually he breaks off from there. They have one church in the settlement, and so he breaks off and starts his own church. And eventually, those two guys, John Lifford and Mr. Oldham, they're banished from the colony because they're causing trouble. In the next year, 1625, John Robinson, who he left back in Holland, he dies of an ague at 50 years old. So their pastor is now dead. Their longtime pastor. In 1626, their first trading house is built in the area. Where they a trading outpost. I forgot it's on some river. So there they really start engaging in a more concerted effort to go into trading. In 1627, they divide their company shares to make more progress in paying their debts to the Virginia Company. So each colonist and each child receives a share of what they have, and each man or share gets 20 acres of land for farming. So each person and also each child and each wife, each woman gets a share of what they have among their company assets, and then for each share you get 20 acres of land to farm on. In 1628, they build their second trading outpost in modern-day Maine. Then in 1629, 35 more colonists arrive, so we're upward to like over 200 probably colonists. And then 1630 is a major event. The John Winthrop fleet, who was the first governor of Boston, they arrive with 700 colonists at one time to settle in Massachusetts Bay. That's the beginning of the Massachusetts Bay colony, and some of them go to the Plymouth colony to live there. Then 3 years later, in 1633, the famous Roger Williams, he comes to Plymouth after being in Salem as a pastor. He joins their church in 1633, but he has some secondary disagreements over doctrine and practice, and so he decides to leave because he sees they're not going to concede to his views, and then he eventually starts the first Baptist congregation in the New World. And then in that same year, 1633, a plague breaks out, killing 20 of them. Then 1636, 3 years afterward, Edward Winslow is appointed the new governor. Bradford is still alive, but he's not the governor anymore. Edward Winslow is. 4 years after, in 1640, the cattle trade with the Massachusetts Bay Colony that they were having, it crashes because there's so few people coming over from England. Although in 1630, the Puritan migration starts, where because they've already settled there, the Puritans decide we're going to leave the persecution of the Anglican Church, and we're going to go over to the New World and found our
if we
society.
think back in history to when we were covering this time, this is when in the 1640s is when the English Civil War is going on. So in the 1630s, when King Charles is still in charge, you have a lot of Puritans fleeing.
Yeah.
In 1640, when they're like, oh, we're about to fight a war, most of them are staying.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and that's why business declines in 1640 at the Plymouth colony. So basically, they're not making as much money. It's not very profitable to be there. In 1643, William Brewster, their ruling elder, dies. I don't know what. He was very old. I believe he was like 80 years old or something like that. In 1645, they signed a treaty with some of the Indians. I forgot exactly which Indians those were, but that staves off some of the rising tensions that eventually erupt into the King Philip's War. And then in 1657, way afterward, William Bradford finally dies. At what age? I don't know. Any other notable events you want to touch on with the Plymouth colony or the Massachusetts Bay colony?
No, but I will just go forward a little bit just on this idea of Thanksgiving. So, as the governments of the colonies, and then even as we started our country, the United States would frequently call for a day of prayer, and sometimes it would be prayer and fasting, other times it would be prayer and feasting. But that this, I think I heard a stat that by 1815, there had been in the United States by either governor or president had been 1,400 calls for, in the history of our country, for a day of prayer. I think a day of prayer was the big one, whether it be with fasting or feasting. And so just how big of a part this was in our early country, and how much prayer and giving it to the Lord was. And you see that with the Pilgrims. And then in 1863, I think it was, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed it as a holiday. And so it became Thanksgiving as we know it. And then another interesting thing, I think it was 1941, FDR tried to move it up a couple weeks, but Congress basically refused and wrote it into law, so then it's stuck where it was. But the reason FDR tried to move it up was for consumerism, to try to make the Christmas season longer so that more goods could be sold, and which I think is just kind of a microcosm of how things are now, or maybe a macrocosm, I don't know, of how we have moved from a day of prayer and Thanksgiving to just commercialism and we get to, and there's still family, and I do appreciate that about the holiday, getting together with family, but we've really lost the prayer part. And I think,
except I said grace at Thanksgiving.
I appreciate that. Hopefully at your Thanksgiving there were some prayers and true Thanksgiving, but the overall idea of Thanksgiving in America has become much more just consumer and much more secular. And so I'm saddened by that in losing just the calling out to the Lord and thanking Him.
What's cool about on that subject?
Yeah.
You know what we're supposed to do every time that we gather as a local church or assembly?
Give thanks.
Yeah. You know what the main event of the weekly gathering at least used to be that had to do with Thanksgiving?
The communion?
Exactly. You know what it used to be called?
What's that?
The Eucharist.
Oh, yeah.
Actually from the Greek.
Yeah.
Eucharist, which the Roman Catholics still use the term, literally means Thanksgiving. So the early church, or at least for some time in the early church, they called the Lord's Supper the Eucharist, the Eucharisto, giving of thanks, because we're giving of thanks for the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah.
So.
And I did want to point out too, with the Pilgrims here in giving thanks, like as we went over, that was a hard year.
Right.
I mean, they lost half their people, and yet they're still giving thanks.
Right.
And obviously, they just had the summer that went pretty well. But just as a kind of reminder to us, is even when we're facing difficulties, to be giving thanks
Right.
in it. And I think, too, you can easily see the Lord's hand. I mean, just in having Squanto be there, like that was completely the Lord setting that up for them to not die.
Right.
But so just this idea of giving thanks and praying so much to the Lord and just focusing on Him even when times are hard. When times are hard or when times are good.
Right.
All the time.
Like Paul says, give thanks in everything. In everything give thanks. Giving thanks for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father. Being abounding with gratitude. And I think we can also learn from the Pilgrims. If the Lord has called you to do something, there's no sacrifice that is too great to make in order to fulfill the Lord's purposes for your life. The Pilgrims were setting out to live by the Word of God according to their consciences, and they risked their lives to do so.
Yeah.
And many of them paid with their lives, and did not even see the fruit of their labors.
But I would say they didn't see the fruit of their labors on this earth.
Right, but they will in eternity.
And I would also say that I think another error a lot of people make in assessing the first Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims is they clothe the Pilgrims in modern American values.
Yeah.
And they make America the promised land. Whereas I don't think that's accurate for the Pilgrims. I think they were obviously trying to get away from worldliness. And I think they were more focused on the heavenly city,
of course,
the heavenly home, instead of just this place where they could be away from everybody.
Right. But that motivated them.
It did, yes.
To try as much as possible to make their community as heavenly as possible on this earth.
Which I do think another lesson in this too is that this is kind of a sad lesson, but a good lesson for us, is that they got away from all the evils of Europe, or however you would want to say it. But I think you see that the evil is in the heart of man.
Right. That
they get to America, and it's not like oh sure there's hardship, but everything's perfect. It's the heart of man. I mean, we see it with the Indians. We see it even with themselves. Right. In that a couple of generations later, they've lost most of their kids. Maybe I don't know. Yeah, I guess a couple of generations.
Talking about as regards faithfulness to
and how their faith had declined so much. I even remember I read something like the 1640s or 1650s. Basically, one of the pastors had said, we brought our kids here and we raised them up to be Christians, but we were really just preparing them for, like, I forget what it was, if it was like colonialism. But basically how it didn't go how they thought it would. That they would just have this like almost utopian society that anytime when we're on this earth, there's still going to be evil around. And like for raising your kids, if you isolate them from everybody else, they will still be evil because they have sinful nature inside of them. And so same idea here. They tried to get away from worldliness, and the world was still there. Right.
That's why we need to avoid being conformed to the world, rather be renewed by transformed by the renewing of our minds to the Word of God. One thing I wanted to end on was what in John Robinson's farewell address to the Pilgrims when they're leaving Holland. Edward Winslow records him as saying this: "And if God should reveal anything to us by any other instrument of His, to be as ready to receive it as ever we were to receive any truth by His ministry," Robinson's. "For he was very confident the Lord had more truth and light yet to break forth out of His holy word. He took occasion also miserably to bewail the state and condition of the Reformed churches, who were come to a purity in religion and would go no further than the instruments of the Reformation. As, for example, the Lutherans, they could not be drawn to go beyond what Luther saw, for whatever part of God's will he had further imparted and revealed to Calvin, they'll rather die than embrace it. And so also saith he, you see the Calvinists, they stick where he left them, a misery much to be lamented. rejected. For though they were precious shining lights in their times, yet God had not revealed his whole will to them. And were they now living, saith he, they would be as ready and willing to embrace further light as that they had received. Here also he put us in mind of our church covenant, at least that part of it, whereby we promise and covenant with God and one another to receive whatsoever light or truth shall be made known to us from his written word, but withal exhorted us to take heed what we receive for truth, and well to examine and compare, and weigh it with other scriptures of truth before we received it. For, saith he, it is not possible the Christian world should come so lately out of such thick anti-Christian darkness, and that full perfection of knowledge should break forth at once. So he was saying, we need to constantly be conforming our thinking, our beliefs, our attitudes, and our practices according to God's word, because we have not yet reached the fullness of truth and of knowledge. I think that's a pilgrim spirit we need to embrace as evangelical Christians today, and also the fact that the Christians loved one another like family. They really carried that out, the commandment of love. So I don't know where we'll go from here in the next episode, but if you don't have anything else to close with, Casey,
I'm good.
I think we'll end this edition of our special edition of the Pilgrims episode of the King's Hand in History podcast for 2024. Thank you for listening. We hope it encouraged you. You can check us out on Facebook at our Facebook group, the King's Hand in History Students. Will you please, if you appreciate this podcast, subscribe so you get notifications for new episodes. Also, like it and share it as you feel led to. And check out our my blog, bearingchrist.blog. Please pray for us. And until next time, thanks for listening, and God bless.